There are moments when the voice of heaven does not shout, it whispers, and the world changes not in thunder, but in trembling hands. Welcome to the Bible Weaver, where ancient voices rise again, where fear becomes courage, and the weakest men carry heaven's fire. If stories of faith and fire awaken something in you, stay and listen, for this is the story of a man who doubted everything, even God, until he learned that weakness was heaven's favorite weapon. The valley lay under the shadow of Midian. For 7 years, their raiders had poured down from the eastern deserts like locusts. Every harvest, every flock, every ounce of hope was stolen. Israel's fields lay stripped and silent, their barns empty, their hearts hollowed. And in that silence, faith starved. Somewhere in the hills, hidden beneath the threshold of fear, a man named Gideon beat wheat in a wine press, a place meant for crushing grapes, not grain. He did it in secret, crouched low, his hands moving in the half-light as if afraid the sound itself would betray him. The dust clung to his skin. Each strike of the flail echoed like a confession. He was not a hero. He was the smallest son of the smallest clan in Manasseh, a man who prayed with one eye open. And yet, that was where heaven found him. A presence appeared beside the oak. Not a storm, not a fire, but a calm, the kind of calm that makes men tremble. The figure sat in the shadow as if it owned the light. When it spoke, the words cut through the air like sunlight through fog. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon froze, the flail slipping from his hands. "Mighty warrior?" he muttered, half to himself. He looked around. There was no one else. "Pardon me, my lord," he said cautiously. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are the wonders our ancestors told us about?" The figure's gaze did not shift. It simply said, "Go in the strength you have. Have I not sent you?" Something in Gideon's chest cracked, a space he had kept locked for years. Still, he argued, "My clan is the weakest, and I am the least in my family." But the voice replied, calm and final, "I will be with you. You will strike down Midian as one man." And in that moment, something ancient stirred in Gideon. Not confidence, but calling. Faith did not roar. It whispered, "What if this is true?" That night, the stars hung heavy and near. Gideon built a small altar of stone, its edges rough, its purpose uncertain. He placed an offering there, bread, meat, the fragile evidence of belief. When the figure touched it with the tip of its staff, fire rose from the rock, devouring the sacrifice in silence. The light burned his face, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. He fell to the ground, his heart pounding like a drum before battle. "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face," he whispered. But the voice came again, this time from within. "Peace. Do not fear. You shall not die." So he named the altar Yahweh Shalom. The Lord is peace. It stood in the dark as a flame that did not consume, a promise that fear was no longer master. Days passed, and with them came the first command. It was not to fight, but to destroy. "Pull down your father's altar to Baal," the voice said, "and cut down the Asherah beside it." Gideon stared at the idol, a towering pillar of stone, its base cracked with old offerings of wine and oil. He knew what it meant. This was rebellion, not against enemies, but against his own blood. So he took 10 men, not brave men, only willing. And by night, they pulled the idol down. The crash echoed through the valley like a thunderclap. The next morning, the town awoke to dust and fury. "Who has done this thing?" they shouted. and someone whispered, "Gideon, son of Joash." The mob gathered, stones in hand, but Joash stepped forward, his voice as sharp as the wind that cuts across stone. "If Baal is a god, let him defend himself." The crowd fell silent. From that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, the one who contends with Baal. And somewhere the heavens smiled, but Midian had heard of him. Their armies gathered in the valley of Jezreel, camels beyond number, warriors like the sand by the sea. When Gideon looked upon them, his courage drained like water through fingers. He built another altar, but this one was made of doubt. He laid before the Lord a fleece of wool and whispered, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, then let the fleece be wet with dew and all the ground dry." Morning came. He wrung a bowl full of water from the fleece, and yet doubt still clung like dew on his soul. He asked again, "Let the fleece be dry and the ground wet." And again it was so. Faith is rarely born in fire. More often it is coaxed, drop by drop, like dew upon dry ground. When word spread that Gideon was raising an army, men came from every tribe, 32,000 strong. The camp was a forest of banners and voices, and for the first time Gideon believed victory might be possible. But that night the voice returned, "You have too many men. If Israel wins, they will boast that they did it by their own strength." Too many men. It was a sentence no general had ever heard. Still, Gideon obeyed. "Whoever is fearful, let him return home." He watched as 22,000 turned back, their torches shrinking into the distance. 10,000 remained, lean, silent, waiting. But again the voice came. Still too many. He led them to the water, and the test was strange. Those who knelt to drink were sent away. Those who cupped the water to their mouths were chosen. When it was done, only 300 stood. 300 men against an ocean of Midian, and heaven whispered, "Now it will be clear who fights this war." Night fell. The valley below shimmered with campfires, 1,000 small suns burning against the dark. The air smelled of iron and sweat and fear. Gideon crept among the sleeping army, and at the edge of the camp he heard a dream being told. One soldier speaking to another, "I dreamed a loaf of barley bread rolled into the camp and struck the tent, and it collapsed." The other replied, "That can be nothing but the sword of Gideon." Faith flared in his chest. Like a struck spark, he fell to his knees, and when he rose, his fear had turned to fire. He returned to his 300 and whispered, "Get up. The Lord has delivered the camp into our hands." The moon hung like a silent drum over the valley of Jezreel. Below, the Midianite sea glittered with 1,000 fires, circles of men, heaps of spears, shadows of camels kneeling like dark ships at anchor. The air was crowded with the smells of an army asleep. Leather, sweat, cooked grain, metal cooling, arrogance at rest. From the ridges above them came only the hush of dry grass and the whisper of heaven waiting. Gideon moved along the line of 300. He touched shoulders, not with the authority of a king, but with the certainty of a man who had heard God breathe. Each soldier carried strange weapons for a war, a trumpet, a clay jar, and a torch hidden inside. No sword was drawn, no shield flashed. It looked less like an army than a midnight procession for the dead. In a way, it was. He divided them into 3 companies, threading them like needles through the rock and scrub until each unit watched a different face of the valley. He crouched with the vest company, eyes reflecting a thin stripe of moonlight. "Look at me," he whispered, voice low and steady. "Do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, you blow yours all around the camp. Then shout with one voice, 'A sword for the Lord and for Gideon,' and hold high the light that has been hidden." They nodded. No bravado answered him, only that quiet, sharpened silence that comes to men who have run out of themselves and found faith waiting where fear used to live. Midnight turned the valley colder. The Midian camp shifted in its sleep. A snort from a horse, the jingle of a bridle, a man rolling over to dream of plunder. Somewhere a sentry yawned, blinked at the harmless black teeth of the hills, and wished the night would hurry. It would, just not the way he hoped. Gideon raised his trumpet. For a breath, the world held still, as if taking one last sip of darkness. Then the horn sang. It wasn't music. It was a tear in the air, a golden wound ripping outward in all directions. Echo answered echo between the hills. At the same heartbeat, far off to left and right, two more blasts erupted. Three voices of brass cutting the night like knives. Gideon struck his jar against the rock. Clay burst and rained down. Light sprang up, naked, bright, defiant, around the valleys. Rim, jars shattered by the hundreds, and torches leapt to life, constellations dragged down to the earth to burn where men could see them. A sword for the Lord and for Gideon. The shout crashed across the Midian Sea. Tents heaved. Men lurched awake into a world on fire. 1,000 small suns on the hills. Horns screaming from everywhere and nowhere. Jars exploding. The night itself turning into an army with 100 hands. Panic rose the way flame does when it finds dry cedar. A sentry sprinted, tangling his legs in ropes. A camel tore free, dragging a wooden peg like an arrow. A captain threw open his tent to a torrent of sound and light, and seeing what no tactic could explain, made the decision fear always makes. He swung at the nearest shape. Another soldier, equally blind with terror, answered. Steel found flesh, a single spark in a field of straw. Chaos blossomed. Trumpets went on and on, 300 throats pulsing brass until lungs burned. The shout repeated, not weakening but gathering weight. A sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Torches held high like verdicts, like sentences already carried out. The ring of fire seemed endless, as if the hills themselves had switched on and become living towers. In the Midian middle, commands collided. Form lines, to horse, to the ridge, to the river. They're among us. They're 10,000. No two orders agreed. No man knew whose banner to find because every ridge looked like a banner, every torch like a standard, every trumpet like an army. A prince vaulted onto a camel and slashed at a shadow that slashed back and discovered too late it wore the same colors he did. Fear turned the camp into a millstone, grinding man against man. Blades rose and fell without names. The first wave of fleeing men trampled the second. The second fouled the third. The third broke the lines entirely. Panic is a strategy when God writes it. Gideon's 300 did not descend. They tightened the sound, lifted the light, drove the vision deeper into the mind. You are surrounded. On the ridge, Gideon watched it all like a man reading prophecy come true in ink of fire. He lifted his trumpet again. The note he blew was lower, rounder, almost merciful. And yet it undid what little order the enemy still possessed. The river of Midian broke its banks. Men ran. Camels screamed and bolted. Tents collapsed under the weight of feet that no longer cared where home was. Gideon signaled. The three companies advanced, not to slaughter, but to shepherd the stampede, to push it the same direction a shepherd drives wolves into a ravine. The goal was never the camp. It was the flight. Hold the light. Keep the horns hot. Press them to the fords, he said, voice steady, the calm at the center of the storm. And the men obeyed, their torches stabbing the dark, their trumpets pounding the air. The hills walked toward the valley. The valley ran from itself. At the eastern edge, the land fell away to the Jordan crossings, narrow places where water braided itself into shallows and men must funnel shoulder to shoulder. Gideon's mind drew the map in fire. He split his 300 yet again, threads of light peeling off, intercepting, herding, harrying. Wherever a pocket of Midian tried to gather, a trumpet fell upon it like a hammer, and the pocket burst, spilling its fear back into the stream. In the chaos, two names rose like stones that refused to roll. Oreb and Zeb, princes who had feasted on Israel's hunger for 7 years. Word moved faster than horses. They flee with the best riders. They know the fords. Gideon's eyes hardened. Then we will own the fords before they do. A runner came gasping from the south. The men of Ephraim hear your horns. Another from the north. Naphtali is waking. Asher too. Gideon nodded once. Multiplication without counting. Faith's arithmetic. He sent messengers slicing into the night. Cut them off at the waters, every crossing, every mouth of the river. Do not fight their strength. Fight their direction. Back in the valley, the last of the tents gave up and fell. Cooking fires spread into ropes of flame, then into sheets. Bronze sang its old song against bronze. The smell thickened. Smoke, fierce sweat, blood, lamp oil, scorched hair. The ground, trampled to powder, held the imprint of 1,000 decisions made in the same instant. Run. Anywhere. Now. From the ridge, a young man named Shammah lowered his trumpet, chest heaving. My lord, are we few enough to fall? He asked, honest and raw. Gideon looked at the valley, at the ocean of enemies now fleeing from a ring of 300 lights, and allowed himself a single breath of astonishment. We are few enough, he said, to prove who wins this war. They ran then, the 300, down through scrub and shale, torches high, horns still brazen. Their feet cut grooves in the hillside. Stones skittered ahead like sparks. They did not plunge into the camp. They ran past it, choosing angles over clashes, staring rather than striking. Where a Midianite looked up and saw a torch at his left, he wheeled right, and there another torch drove him faster. Where he turned to fight, a horn exploded in his ear, and his sword found a fellow fugitive before it found the phantom he feared. By the time the first companies reached the lower slopes, Ephraim had begun to rise from the south like a wall of men made of stone. From the north came the first edges of Asher and Naphtali, cutting wedges of pursuit into the stream. The river crossings narrowed the brave and the terrified into one species, prey. Oreb and Zeb, with retinues once called proud, now looked like thorns blowing in wind. On a ledge above the ford of Beth-barah, Gideon paused to breathe and listen. The valley behind him raged. The river ahead hissed with bodies and oaths. He lifted his eyes to the thin line where eastern darkness breaks into first light. He spoke a single sentence to the men around him. Let the Lord's voice finish what our hands began. Then he signaled again. Trumpets roared. Torches flared. The night took one last step backward. At the first ford, Oreb tried to rally, screaming names he thought still meant something. A horn answered from the left bank, another from the right, and his men found enemies wearing their own colors. He cut down one, then another, then the truth cut him. There was no army to command, only fear to ride, and fear throws every rider. They dragged him onto a rock that once held the cooking pots of travelers, and, with a bitter symmetry only heaven arranges, ended him there. The place kept his name like a stain, the Rock of Oreb. Farther down, Zeb dared the vineyards that ran so close to the water men could drink from among the grapes. He crashed through trellises. Gods crashed with him. Panic harvested the vines before the season could. At a wine press, deep and square and old, his horse stumbled, and Zeb fell where the grapes fall. The men of Ephraim surrounded the press, torches bobbing like watchful eyes. Someone lowered a blade. The wine press remembered its purpose. The place learned a new word, the wine press of Zeb. The names went out on the wind, traveling upstream to where Gideon stood. One prince ended on a rock, one in a press. Gideon did not cheer. Victory never felt like wine in his mouth. It felt like obedience, clean, hard, and costly. Night began to bleach toward gray. The torches looked less like miracles and more like ordinary fire. The horns, hoarse with triumph, fell silent one by one, as if remembering that breath is not unending. What remained was pursuit, and pursuit is the part of victory men are most tempted to own. Gideon gathered his captains. Dust streaked their faces. Light burned in their eyes. "We are not done," he said. "Two kings remain, Zeba and Zalmunna. The princes fall fast, the kings fall hard." He pointed east into the deepening pallor where dawn would soon appear. Across Jordan. "We cross hungry if we must. This night belongs to God, but this morning we'll ask for men." They stared at the river, thin, cold, indifferent, and nodded. Some tightened sandals, others retied the rags around bleeding hands. No one asked about the swords they hadn't drawn. They had discovered another kind. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, cleared his throat. "My lord, tonight I feared we were only noise." Gideon's mouth twitched at the edge, a smile with too much understanding to be joy. "So did the enemy," he said. And then the noise became truth. They started forward again, 300 shapes moving east, small against the long back of the land. Behind them, the valley smoldered, and names hardened into memory. Ahead, the river whispered of cold and crossings and kings not yet convinced that thrones can drown. On the last ridge before the descent, Gideon turned once more to look. The hills still glowed in places where discarded torches lay burning to their ends. He could almost believe he saw the angel again, seated as before beneath an invisible oak, watching the field as a farmer watches his harvest, measured, patient, satisfied with ripe things. Gideon lowered his head and spoke where only God could hear. "Make us weaker if you must. Only make your will strong." The wind came up from the river and answered like a hand on the shoulder. That is how heaven wins. The 300 went down into the cut of the land, toward water and morning and the hard, clean edge of finishing what God had begun. Dawn rose gray over the Jordan. The light was thin, stretched tight, like the breath of men who had not slept. The 300 moved through dust that tasted of metal and victory half-earned. Behind them, the valley still smoked. Ahead, the land opened into a plain that shimmered with heat even before the sun found it. They had no food left. The trumpets hung silent at their sides. Their faith, for now, had to march on empty stomachs. Gideon walked at the front. His sandals were cut from the same hide he had worn when the angel found him. Only the dust was different. He felt the same fear, the same trembling, but it carried a new shape, the weight of command. God had given him victory once. Now God was silent. And silence, he was learning, can be heavier than battle. They reached the fords at daybreak. Water glittered cold and deceptive. The men drank, knelt, rose again without complaint. Gideon looked east, where the desert swelled into a mirage of movement. Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian, fleeing with what was left of their armies. Between them and pursuit lay the towns of Sukkoth and Penuel, both of Israel's blood, both prosperous from the trade that passed their gates. He sent messengers ahead. "Give my men bread," he said, "for they are weary, and we chase the kings of Midian." The messengers returned with eyes lowered. Sukkoth refused. They said, "Do you already have the kings in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?" The words struck harder than hunger. Gideon's jaw clenched. "Write this down," he said quietly, "for we will return. And when we do, we will teach Sukkoth with thorns." He looked toward the towers of Penuel, their stones bright in the morning. "Go there." Again the answer came back, "No bread until victory is certain." Gideon's heart tightened. He remembered the silence after Jericho's fall, the peace that had felt like holiness. This silence was different. It hummed with something darker. "When I return in peace," he said, "I will tear down this tower." Then he turned east again and kept walking. The desert opened like a furnace. The men moved through heat that rippled their horizon into water that was not there. Sand scoured their feet raw. The sound of armor became the sound of breathing, metal rubbing against skin. Still, they followed Gideon. Faith had broken walls. Perhaps it could outlast thirst. By midday, they saw them. A scatter of dark tents moving against the light, the last camp of kings who had once believed the land theirs to devour. Gideon signaled a halt. "Divide again," he said, voice rough with dust. "Half circle from the south, half from the north. No horns this time, only silence. Let fear remember its name." When the trap closed, it did so without noise. The Midianites were too tired to form ranks, too starved of hope to look up until the sand around them began to move. Then came the first cry, high, broken, quickly cut off. Gideon's 300 poured from the dunes like wind shadows, blades catching what little light the day had left. It was not slaughter, it was completion. Zebah and Zalmunna fled east on horseback, their cloaks snapping like torn banners. Gideon followed with a handful of riders, horses borrowed, lungs already bleeding from the chase. They crossed into a wilder desert where even the sun seemed lost. The kings stumbled upon a camp of their own people who had not yet heard of defeat. Gideon struck before knowledge could reach them. The camp broke apart like glass in the wind. The kings were taken alive. He stood over them. Two men whose names had filled songs of fear for 7 years. Now they were dust-streaked, eyes hollow. Gideon looked at them and felt nothing. Not triumph, not rage. Only the strange emptiness that comes when a promise has been kept too long. "You killed my brothers," he said, voice low. "Men who looked like me, sons of my mother." Zebah met his gaze without pride. "As you are, so were they, each one like a prince." Gideon's hand tightened on the sword. "Then as a prince, you shall die." He raised the blade. The sound it made was small. No trumpet followed, no echo, only the wind. By evening, they reached the river again. Succoth's elders came out to meet them, their faces carved from courtesy. "You have captured the kings," they said. Gideon dismounted, too weary for anger. He took thorns from the wilderness and cords from his men's packs, bound them together, and struck the elders, not in fury, but in lesson. "You fed your fear instead of your brothers," he said. "Now taste the fruit of it." At Penuel, he did as he had promised. The tower came down stone by stone until it lay like the wall of Jericho, proud once, silent now. When it was done, the people followed him north. The war was over. The chase had ended. The kings were gone, the idols broken, the fields free again. Yet Gideon felt the old whisper return, not the one that called him mighty, but the one that asked, "Who are you now that there are no battles left to fight?" He returned to Ophrah, his home, and the people met him with shouts. They said, "Rule over us, you and your sons after you." He raised a hand, weary of echoes. "I will not rule over you," he said, "nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." The crowd roared approval, hearing only the part that pleased them. Men often do. But Gideon gathered gold from their spoils and made an ephod, a garment meant for priests, woven with threads that caught the light like captured sun. He placed it in his city. At first it was remembrance, then it became curiosity, then worship. What had begun in obedience ended in ornament. Years passed. The land had peace for 40 years, the years of Gideon. Children grew up playing in fields their fathers had once fought across. The horns rusted. The torches were forgotten. Gideon himself grew gray, his voice softer, his hands slower. Some nights he sat beneath the same oak where the angel once found him. He could still smell the wheat, still feel the fear, still hear that first impossible greeting. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." He smiled then, not the smile of victory, but of understanding. He had learned that faith begins not when walls fall or kings die, but when God stops speaking and a man keeps walking anyway. When he died, they buried him in the tomb of his father Joash. The peace he had bought began to fray. Israel turned again to the idols he had broken. The effort gleamed in the sun, silent as stone, and heaven watched, waiting for another whisper to be heard. Zeku's voice softens to closing timbre. Faith wins battles, pride builds them again. The wars of heaven and earth never end, only change their names. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Let the echo of obedience travel farther than fear. This is the Bible Weaver, where ancient voices still rise, and every victory whispers the same truth. Heaven never needed armies, only faith.